being isolated and being disconnected, being distanced, if you will, from people is a huge issue. In that session, you might remember we talked about how isolation and loneliness are actually lethal, how they literally are physiologically bad for the human condition, and that being lonely or being isolated um, is tantamount to like smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day from a sense of health disparity. So literally, isolation loneliness is a huge problem. Certainly in the disability community, it's even more exacerbated. Uh, that session led us to our second session, which we just had 2 weeks ago, and that session focused in on, if you have loneliness and isolation as issues, the way that you address them is by helping people find ways to engage and to build relationships. And we know that relationships, social capital, was the the theme that we examined in that second session. But social capital, in a way, is the antidote to loneliness and isolation. If you're disconnected, if you're rendered to be on your own and by yourself, the way to a better experience is by building relationships, right? So in that session, session two, we really focused in on social capital. What is it? What does it do? How does it manifest? What are the ways that we can support or intervene in supporting people to build more social capital? Okay? Um, those two topics, social isolation and social capital, are more micro topics in that we were looking at the individual situation and how the individual can build more relationships to get a better outcome in their life. Um, that leads us to our topic for today, which is really now shifting from micro to macro, because where we build relationships is in the community, is in the realities of community. And so from an intervention point of view, it really makes sense that if isolation and loneliness are a problem and the answer to that problem is building relationships, then the third piece of that puzzle is finding the places and spaces where people can build relationships. And that takes us to our topic today, which is community mapping. What is out there in our community? How would we come to identify it and literally codify a a framework of better understanding where the opportunities are in our community? Right? So with that in mind, we're gonna kind of go down this lane. We're gonna look at community mapping as a process. We're gonna look at it from its generic roots, and then we're gonna try to sort of tighten it to think about how we could apply, those of us that are on the call, who represent human service agencies or disability support agencies, how we might be able to utilize community mapping as a strategy for building community. So, with that in mind, here's a definition from Peter Block, and Peter Block is really one of the really I think articulate purveyors of understanding community. Block says that community is the container within which our longing to be is fulfilled. Our longing to be. Without the connectedness of community, he goes on to say, we will continue to choose not to be. So what Block is really, I think, articulating in this quote is the essence of community is really that which fulfills us. It's where we find relationships and then where we can build relationships. Now, when we think about community, and most of us have thought about community for a long time. I mean, we talk about being community based, and that we're community focused, and that we really understand community. Yet, for many of us, we have not really come to understand our communities. And therein brings us to this notion of community mapping. One of the things we quickly think about with community is geography, territory, right? And this Gary Larson cartoon, I think summarizes this notion of territory. It's a cartoon that shows a guy and his son in their yard, and there's fences all around, and there's a tree in the next door neighbor's yard, and at the top of the tree is a sparrow, and the sparrow is singing, right? And the caption says, and now, Randy, by use of song, the male sparrow will stake out his territory, an instinct that's common among the lower animals, right? And of course, the humor of the slide is that when you look at the cartoon, you'll see there's fences and yards, and territory is a phenomena that affects all of us, not just the lower animals. And in fact, humans probably have been the most destructive as it relates to territory. I remember in college reading a book by Robert Ardrey called Territorial Imperative, which really kind of looked at the power of territory. So when we think about community, community is territory. There's no question. When we think about community, we think about our own definition of where we find ourselves. However, one of the things I want to push us today is to go further in thinking about community. Einstein famously said, the significant problems we face today can't be solved at the same level we were at when we created those problems. And the same is true with the challenges that we find in terms of getting people included in community and involved in community. Um, I think when we started that agenda, we focused mostly from the micro model. People had disabilities, their disabilities created impositions. The impositions got in the way of their engagement in community. And if only we could lessen their impositions, we would then be further along the path of getting people more engaged in community, right? That's using a micro sort of analysis. And I think Einstein's quote here, that the problem that we face, which is community inclusion, community involvement, community engagement, all those terms that we hold dear, they cannot be solved from a micro perspective. We've got to go to another place, and that really gets us to thinking about this idea of community, because social capital is the goal. If people build relationships, things get better in their lives. They have more opportunity. They're more confident. They find themselves to be more more relevant, right? Now here's a definition of community. It's a network of different people who come together regularly for something in common. And this definition applies to, obviously, to territory, but it applies in so many other ways in communities that we're members of, right? But the notion of finding commonality with other people is the core element to understanding community. Now, just as a further sort of delineation here, communities can be actual, and most of the time that's how we think of them. They're actual live settings, places, and they're either formal or informal. Formal meaning that there is some real clear intentionality and there's some invitation for that intentionality, or informal, where people kind of just go to a coffee shop, and they see some other people and they start chatting. There's no focused intentionality. It's an informal opportunity to engage, right? However, actual communities which are live, um, there is some obligation that people bring to those communities around some common issue. Next session, we're gonna examine that a little bit more closer when we're talking about infrastructure. But for our purposes today, we're really thinking about community and what is out in community and how can we map it and get our hands around it. Now, along with actual community is virtual community. And virtual communities are really manifested like we are today, right? Where we're on an internet platform, Zoom, and we're gathered around, an agenda. And that agenda is how can we support people to be more engaged in community, and especially people who are in rural areas where there's lots of space and dispersal that's in the way. Right? So virtual communities are online; they're technologically oriented, but they still are groupings of people around some common cause. Um, so this idea of actual and virtual, I think we know that they're out there, but the difference, one of the clear differences, and this has really been corroborated by researchers, and especially more recently with the advent of online communities, is the um, the fact that a virtual community does not have the satisfaction of an actual community. There's something about our humanness that when we're with some people, looking into their eyes, sharing space, breathing air with them, that there's something about that that is more satisfying than this greater distance that we find in virtual communities, where we have these little squares on our screen and we look at these faces in the squares, and there's something missing there. And I think any of us would admit to that. So we're using this kind of virtual medium because we're in a pandemic that gets in the way of our physically connecting, although we would like to physically connect. And if we were together in some room talking about community mapping, there it would be so much more robust and juicier than looking at a screen, looking at Condeluci's slides, seeing his little face in a Brady Bunch square on my screen, right? So actual community is really the most satisfying and the more satisfying. And in a way, when we think about community building and when we think about this process today of community mapping as a intervention to identify places and spaces, the hope is that as the pandemic runs its course, as the vaccinations begin to happen, as herd immunity begins to develop, we can get back to a more actual endeavors. Um, and then lastly, on this notion of actual and virtual, we have both urban, suburban, and rural settings, and that really refers to size and dispersal. In an urban setting, very dense. A suburban setting, a little more space. In a rural setting, greater levels of space, right? And there's pros and cons to all three of these delineations: urban, suburban, and rural, that have an impact. However, in community mapping, that doesn't really matter. I mean, you can map a rural area as much as you can map a dense urban block of streets. So we'll get into that as we move forward. Now, just again, a 30,000-foot view of this idea of community, this macro perspective of community, there's functions to community, and those functions serve different purposes. Um, we're going to just quickly review 6 functions. Uh, on this slide, sociability centers where we can socialize, where we can connect in a social way with our community. Interpersonal and mutual aid, which are things that help us, especially in a time of crises, where people can come together and support one another and help one another. You see when a tornado, goes through, the next day, you see neighbors helping one another, deal with the devastation of the tornado. But also, communities function as an organizational base, and in some ways as a point of identity. I know, for example, when you think about the community that you come from, where you live, or the community maybe where you grew up, and you summarize it, you can get some kind of a sense of that, the references of that. For example, in Pittsburgh, I live in a community called McKees Rocks, and it's referred to as the Rocks. That's what people refer to it. It's blue collar. It's very, very poor. A lot of public housing in this community. It's it's a sort of blue collar manufacturing community, and when you tell anybody you're from the Rocks in the Pittsburgh area, they immediately say, "Oh my God, and the Rocks! Oh man, you must be a hard nosed person, because that's a tough area." Conversely, in Pittsburgh, there's a community called Shadyside. It's in the city of Pittsburgh. And Shadyside is the higher socioeconomic community in the Pittsburgh area. And if you tell people you're from Shadyside, they immediately think, "Oh man, you must have some money. You must really, you must really be well heeled to be, from Shadyside, or to live in Shadyside." So communities have these sort of stereotypes and these auras that sometimes unfold, right? Sometimes they resort to status, or maybe even devaluation, depending upon how that community is seen or perceived. So social capital, as we discussed last time we met, is the value we get from community connections. Social infrastructure, which is a separate phenomenon we're going to look at next time we meet in our 4th session. But social infrastructure is the place or setting, and then the culture that unfolds in that place or setting, that really become critical to that setting's functioning. So we're going to examine that next time, because that becomes really important to the inclusion agenda. But community mapping is the process by which we identify the community resources and the community activities that unfold in the geography that we're interested in, or in the target that we're interested in. And so as we begin to unravel this, we need to appreciate that we're really looking macro now. This is sort of in the boundaries of anthropology and sociology and community related theory. Margaret Mead said that if we are to achieve a richer culture, rich in contrasting values, we must recognize the whole gamut of human potentiality. And so weave an arbitrary social fabric, one in which every diverse human gift will find a fitting place. You know, this is a beautiful, I think, overview of what community could be, right? That tapestry of a diversity, and that there are some communities that exhibit that. There are other communities that are much more monolithic that don't exhibit that. And as we begin to think about getting people connected, we need to recognize that we have all different types of communities and community infrastructures. So, what is community mapping? And community mapping has been with us as a social tool for a number of years. Sociologists first started to really use this intentionally back in the 60s and 70s in terms of identifying community. And community mapping is still a key tool that's taught in community organizing approaches and civic development, community development agendas. But it's a process by which we discover the elements of community. Okay, and so the mapping is really trying to identify and catalog or codify those resources in community. Now, in a generic way, in a general way, there's been lots of really interesting approaches to community mapping. The one that I've really gotten excited about and have utilized in my own practice is really the process that's taught at Northwestern University in Chicago. It's called the asset-based community development process, ABCD, asset-based community development. And the asset-based community development manual that I'm holding up on the screen now is called Building Community from the Inside Out. And I had an opportunity to study a bit there and to attend community mapping sessions to get a better sense of the ABCD approach to community mapping. And now we'll get into that a little bit more, but there's some core theories that undergird community mapping as a process. Right? Sometimes community mapping can be deficit oriented, right? That is, where community leaders want to find the problems of community. So where are the drugs and where are the gangs and where are the the crime in community? That's a deficit based approach. Some of the more enlightened agenda for mapping really comes more from an asset based approach where you look for the gifts, talents of a community, even though there might be crime or negative things. Every community has these assets to them, right? And sometimes those assets are found in the most unsuspecting of places. I know in some of the stuff of ABCD approach in Chicago, where community mapping has looked at some of the areas where there's the greatest poverty in Chicago, found these unbelievable pockets of talent and unique kinds of things that really were strength based, right? So asset based, relationship based, and then knowing that the potency of community resides in community. That it's a mistake to think we could go in and fix a community by I don't know, bringing something into that community that's going to um, supplement it. Um, that's been tried a lot and discovered by community developers and community builders that those kinds of things are not nearly as viable as building on the assets that already exist in community and working from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Now, there are steps in community mapping generally, and we're gonna look at how how we could use a community mapping process in the work we do. But in a general sense, for any community mapping, you need to define the community that you want to map and the intentionality of the process. Like what are you doing and why are you doing it? Right? Where are you doing it? Um, Community mapping always convenes a group of people who do it. For example, the recommendations that I'm going to make to our CP of New York State affiliates is that in fact you get more proficient in mapping community in your catchment area, your service area, and that you get some of your staff who really have a kind of a bent or an interest in this as part of the core mapping group. You get organized, begin to say, okay, we can't do all of this today. Well, here's our process. We're going to start in this community. We're going to then move forward to other communities. How you're making decisions about how you're going to gather this information. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we focus in. And then you create a map or a database of some sort, and then activate the information that you uncover in your mapping process towards some end. Right? That's why you do mapping, is not just to do it because it sounds cool or it sounds like it's new or innovative. You map for an intentional reason, right? And in our process, what we're really, our intention here is we want to see people engaged, connected, and involved in their community, included in their community. And so the intentionality here is that the stuff we find in the map, when we do the mapping process, we're going to be able to utilize those resources to get people engaged. Not every one of those resources, but many of them that we come to discover. Now, historically and strategically, there are target groups where mapping really can be helpful, right? Where groups of people who are at risk might be identified, and then really looking at the mapping process of the resources that can facilitate or help the group that's at risk become more connected. And we know, when we talked about loneliness and isolation in our first week, these very same groups were at risk groups for loneliness and isolation. So in a generic way, let's just think about the dimensions of community. What is out there? And when we say community and community mapping, what are some of the things we might want to identify in that community? And so this is an overview slide: associations, clubs, institutions, groups, physical space, economy, individual clusters of people. Those are all sort of overview issues. But if we drill down a little bit and we think, what are associations and how might they manifest? So here's just a couple examples, and this is not exhaustive by any stretch, but just to give a picture, and especially if community mapping is a sort of a new thing to you, or if it's a process that you're really, you're just discovering or beginning to think about. We know that there are these kinds of associations, and these are intentional groups who come together for some kind of a cause, right? Um, and there's many, many more, but these are just some of an example of associations for people who come for a cause. Um, and even you can drill down, for example, business organizations. I just had a conversation just the day before yesterday um, with a group called the Pittsburgh Marketing Association, right? And it's a trade association of people who do marketing. They work as marketing and advertising people for their companies, and they gather as an association and talk about marketing stuff and how they could get better at their trade, right? So there are lots of those kinds of groups, and again, in more urban areas you find greater dispersal of these kinds of things, and as we move into rural areas, maybe not as many, but still there are associations that are viable and findable in rural areas. Here's a listing of institutions. Institutions are sort of business oriented. There's economy around the institution's business. Schools, universities, hospitals, libraries, museums, fire, police departments. These are all sort of institutional examples. Um, when we think about community, we know that there are affinity groups, clubs, and groups of people who gather more informally, but intentionally and regularly to engage in some activity. Right? Book club. I I was a member of a book club that after the pandemic, when the pandemic came up, this was a group that met at Barnes and Noble. And then when the pandemic came up, we sort of suspended our activity. But when the pandemic came up, I joined an NPR book club where we read a book and there's a segment on NPR that explores the book and the author comes in, and so there are groups of people who meet around things that they like, right? Block clubs that are responsible for the community where people live, to make sure that the block is safe. People get together. They have rotating dinners at people's homes. Other affinity groups and leagues. This is a whole menagerie of possibility in terms of exploring the community where your target group lives and getting more potential ideas for connection, right? And then now this is examples of space, physical space. On the left-hand side of this slide are outdoor space. On the right-hand side of this slide are indoor spaces that oftentimes become gathering points or places where people gather. And they're public kinds of things where anyone can take part. And understanding these give us again a better picture of our community. When we talk about infrastructure next time, I'm going to really dive into this a little bit deeper in terms of your ability by looking at space to read that community from a sense of softness. Is the community softer? And that means more pliable, that it's easier for people to get in or to engage. Economy, when mappers will talk about, well, what exists economically in our community, and obviously here's a listing of low hanging fruit around those particular things. Um, Local resources. These are usually businesses or groupings of people who have some business agenda or interest agenda, right? Um, and they can provide space. For example, see community-based organizations. The very last thing on there, when our agency, the agency that I retired from a couple years ago, UCP of Pittsburgh, now called Class of Pittsburgh, when we began to really awaken to community and community mapping, um, we began to think about the fact that we had this center, and it was in Oakland. Oakland is the university area of Pittsburgh. University of Pittsburgh's there, Carnegie Mellon University, Chatham College. There's a number of different educational institutes in the Oakland section, right, where we were located. And we had this disability center in Oakland. And it was nice, it was accessible, and there was lots of meeting space, but it was a disability center, right? It was folks with disabilities came there for something. And that's exactly how the community perceived our center. That's where those handicapped people go, right? And when we awaken to say, gee, Manise, we've got to become more relevant to community. We've got to become a resource for our community, not a disability resource, but a meeting space resource. And so we had a very intentional agenda to begin to say, how might we take our center, the CP Center, and make it a community center that could serve the greater community, right? And so what we did was I teach in the School of Social Work, and so I got some graduate students to work on a project with us to survey the community where our center was located. Now, there were some residential homes there, and there was some businesses nearby. So it was a kind of an eclectic community. And so we sent these graduate students out, and they knocked on doors, and they went into businesses, and they all they asked was, if a community center moved in to this neighborhood, what would you like it to do? What do you think would be useful to you? Right? Just somebody who lived in the neighborhood, or somebody who had a business in the neighborhood. And people reacted in various ways to that question. The graduate students came back with all this information, and we sat down and we culled through the information and began to say, gee, people said they would like a voting place, a place where they could vote that was more convenient than the church basement that they're currently using. And people said they would really, like to have, more art, maybe a possible art gallery. And people said, gee, Manise, we'd like to, have a place where we might be able to centralize snow removal stuff, because it's a relatively dense area. Maybe people couldn't afford snow blowers, but maybe if we had some kind of a central spot, we could have snow blowers. So we took all this information and we began to say, how could our agency shift from a disability support center to a community center? And so we did. We took the ideas and we went after some community development grants. We were able to, we took the name UCP of Pittsburgh off the building, and we renamed it the Community Service Center, right? And not UCP Community Service Center, but just the Community Service Center. And what we began to do, we opened an art gallery, and we opened um, uh, a a kitchen where we did soups, and we got a grant to buy snow blowers, and we put a hut in the back where the snow blowers go in, and we created a tree, a volunteer tree where when it snowed, people we would call them, and they would come and get the snow blower, move the snow out. So what we began to do is just become more relevant as a resource to our community. Now, I had some board members that when we began to start to do this, they started to say, how does this help the handicapped? Right? I mean, I signed on as a board member so we could help people with disabilities, and you opened up a polling place. How does that really help our goal here? And that really then was so revealing to me, because it was so clear that we were insulated as an organization. We weren't a community resource at all. We were this little handicap service center. And if somebody had a disability, we were relevant. But if they didn't have a disability, we were irrelevant. And people with disabilities were irrelevant to them. So in a way, some of this thinking about community and community resources, you know, have a powerful, I think, effect in terms of how we're seen. I mean, it would be interesting just to think about how your agency is viewed in your community. What do they think about when they hear the name of your organization, or when they drive by your building? What do people think about? What do they think you do? And what, in a way, are you relevant? Are we relevant to community? So, with those kinds of things said, these are sort of overarching issues, but it's all about engagement. The reason why we map, the reason why we think about community on our own relevance, our own agency's relevance to community, is for engagement purposes. We have men, women, and children with disabilities that we relate to that are isolated or disconnected, are stereotyped, are devalued, are unemployed, are irrelevant to a community, whether they live in rural or urban or suburban areas. So the agenda is to really say, how can we promote engagement? And what do we need to know about our community, and what do we need to be in our community to facilitate that? So let me try to wrap some of this up so that we can have a conversation about this, because I hope that some of this is provocative to you. But uh, Baranowski said, humans are the only species who is not locked into their environment. Their imagination, their reasonable emotional subtlety and toughness make it possible for them to not only accept the environment, but to change the environment, right? This is clearly, I think, in some ways, a macro agenda, right? So when we think about community, and I listed out some of the kinds of resources that are there, some of them may seem irrelevant to you, but recognize that any of these resources do have relevancy, because they are a part of our collection. And people with disabilities, we want to see be a part of that collection as well. Now, one last thing for mapping purposes is to examine some things that maybe are not as evident or not as clear in a resource assessment. For example, look at this third bullet. It's a website called meetup.com, meetup.com. Now, meetup.com is a social network inventory that's data-based, that's virtual, where you can go to their website, meetup.com, and you could type in any interest area that comes to your mind. I don't know, playing chess, or I don't know, spelunking, any interest that you might have or that somebody you support might have. And you type it into meetup.com. It'll ask you for your zip code because this database is geographically sort of ordered. You put in, I don't know, chess, playing chess, and you type in your zip code, whatever it might be. And then you hit enter. And what comes up in the database are clubs, groups, and associations that meet up. And most of the times they meet up at some common area that's not identified for them, but it's a common area, maybe in a park. Maybe they meet up at a bookstore. Maybe they meet up, at a diner. So the identification of the group that meets up is in that database, right? So now what you added to your mapping is a whole variety of other affinity-based groups that are much more maybe informal, that are possible resources for us to use in getting people engaged, right? Getting people connected. Now, this idea, this intentionality of mapping is to identify and put a face to this so that you have the information in front of you, right? And now that information can be used in a variety of ways. That and the idea of mapping, the actions of mapping, is that you can very, very much focus it in on maybe just one person and just map for that one person. You can also map generically or generally what's in our community. You could create a database at your organization that lists, so that whenever your staff meet someone, a new client, who is interested in chess, right? You could go into your own database and identify what are the chess resources that are in, Rochester or, Albany or whatever, part of your community that person is in, right? Now, sometimes the displaying of these databases can be done in a whole variety of ways. I'm working with a group in up near Erie, Pennsylvania, and what we've done is we're creating a scrapbook because they serve people with very cognitive issues, very significant cognitive issues. And a computer database is intimidating. But a scrapbook is something you could sit with somebody and go through, actually having pictures of what the community resource does, or what the activity looks like, right? So again, you can be as creative. How you gather the information can be again, as creative or as intentional as you want it to be, right? You could do surveys. You can already look at pre-existing data sets. I bet you your United Way has a pre-existing data set of resources in that community. I bet you your community development office has some of these things. I'm working with a group in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, right? And this is a group much like our agencies. It's a disability support agency, and we're doing a community mapping process up there. And one of the things that we started to do was take a look at pre-existing data sets. And what we discovered was 7-8 years ago, that community of Sault Ste. Marie did a community mapping process primarily for immigrants who were coming into the area to get to know a little bit of what's out there in Sault Ste. Marie for people immigrating into that community. And so we got our hands on that set of information, already was there. And part now of our process is adding to that, complementing it, supplementing it. Right. So what kind of information do we gather in a map? Right. Um, and what I want to share with you here is that again, the intentionality of some of this. For example, I'm going to show you on the next slide an assessment tool. It's a one-page tool. It's just a little sheet of paper, and we're using this in our with our Erie group, right? The group that that's working on mapping their community up near Erie. And this assessment tool, as you see, is kind of just a generic tool that we're using to identify resources in that community. Let me give an example of how we might use this. We discovered in our mapping a gardening club in their community. This is just a little bit south of Erie, a little town called Hermitage, and we discovered that there was a gardening club, the Buell Gardening Club, right? And the Buell Gardening Club kind of took care of the gardens near the Buell Mansion. The Buell Mansion, Buell was a big steel producer up in the valley there, Sharon, Farrell Valley, where there was a lot of steel. And so there's this mansion, and the Buell Gardening Club meets there at the mansion. And so if we were using a form like this, we would write down where it says name of the venue, right? The Buell Gardening Club. Activity at the venue, taking care of the Buell of the gardens, and having an opportunity to learn more about gardening, right? The contact person, the gatekeeper name, which is a clear thing. And now next session, we're going to talk about gatekeepers in greater detail. But a gatekeeper is somebody in that club already, in that Buell Gardening Club, who can open the gates and welcome in somebody new who's interested in gardening in Hermitage. Now, down in the second section of this form, you'll see there's some questions about, is it accessible? Can people get around? What about parking? Do they take a meal? Is there dues? These are all essential information about this particular resource, so that if we get a new person we're supporting who likes to garden, who is interested in gardening, maybe they never gardened before, but maybe it just sounds interesting to them, here's a potential resource for possible engagement, right? So now this information is put into the scrapbook, and the second page has pictures of people gardening, so that when we're going through the scrapbook with a new person who's just gone referred, we can actually show what they do at the Buell Gardening Club. Now, there's also other methodologies. This is an example I pulled out of the Building Community from the Inside Out book. And this just gives kind of a way you can codify what you come to discover and mapping your community. This is an example. You see, it says the Michigan Humane Society in Detroit. And what do? You know, they protect animals. And what's the address and the phone number and the email, and you know, how might we be able to then utilize this resource for somebody to engage more, right? So there's lots of different ways you can take the information that you gather and that you uncover in your community, and you can keep it in a variety of ways. You can actually create an actual map. I worked with a group in Baltimore, and they actually, you know, had these maps, and we were able to put pins. Once we discovered some of the resources, we put these pins. The pins were color coded, representing a different you know, resource in that community. So what's the benefits of mapping? Obviously, finding a target, a place where somebody can be can go in order to begin to engage a bit more. Once a resource is found, um, then the hope is that connections can follow. That's the intentionality. Becoming a member, how to somebody begins to become a member of something more than themselves, bigger than themselves, and then the relationships that can unfold. So identifying the target is really what mapping helps with. Now that's when our work really just starts, because once we discover the Buell Gardening Club, um, and we come to discover what do they do there, and now we're supporting Joan, and she really wants to know more about gardening. She likes gardening, and so now we want to get into the Buell Gardening Club. So now the mapping process helped us identify the Buell Gardening Club, but actually now getting her in, there's another whole element to that. And that's where infrastructure comes in. What are the rituals, patterns, jargon? How do we soften that so that Joan has an easier sort of intersection with that group? Right? And we'll get into that next week. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So let me summarize this, and then let's open it up to some of the questions maybe that you might have about the mapping process. Burton Blatt from Syracuse University in the great state of New York. Since the beginning of the human experience, man has behaved as if freedom means more to him than his life. Yet, even more important to him is the need to belong to community. Right? Our early thinkers, our thought leaders, people like Burton Blatt, understood that uh, this is about community, what we're doing. And the more we understand community, the more we can codify it, map it, discover the incredible resources, the sooner people will begin to get in. Because when you build relationships, good things happen. People begin to uh, be kinder and gentler. They're softened by virtue of other people that they're meeting in that particular group. Right? So Albert Schweitzer, the first step in the evolution of ethics. And by the way, ethics is nothing more than pro social behaviors with people, is a sense of solidarity with other human beings. What do we have in common? What bonds us? What connects us? Putnam, we talked about Putnam last session when we focused in on social capital. Putnam says if you belong to no community and decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying in half over the next year. We know that community breeds life. Isolation and loneliness breed death. And so getting people connected is really the key. And those key pro-social traits, right? Um, they're simple yet complex, right? Um, we know that these are the things that soften a community: kindness, hospitality, generosity, compassion, forgiveness. They're pro-social behaviors, yet they're complex. People are selectively kind and not always hospitable, and generosity can be very, very, very selective. And um, and so as we think about mapping community, identifying resources, we don't know if these things are going to exist there or not. They may not. But we've got to start with identifying the resource, and then next month we're going to talk about ways that we can soften those communities. Because when we try to bring about change in our society, we're first treated with indifference, then with ridicule, then with abuse, and finally with oppression. And then finally, the greatest challenge is thrown at us. We're treated with respect. This is the most dangerous stage. This quote is really powerful because if you think about human services, you think about our agencies, and you think about how we're perceived in community. Um, I think, I think right now people respect us, but they don't see our relevance. They think we take care of handicapped people. And and community, I think, has pretty much, I don't want to say dismissed us, but they really don't see any relevance to what we do and the people we support to them, right? And and I think we've gotten complacent in this reality, um, and not intentionally and not maliciously, but I think it's relegated us to our own space where we take care of these people, and that's what we do. And that's not what community engagement is about. And that, I think, is not what we were called to do. So let me just finish and this presentation with this final quote. Right? And this is a quote from R. Patrick McMurphy, who was a fictional character in the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. And I'm sure if you haven't read the book or seen the movie, you know a little bit of its impact, its cultural impact on us, because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest really was a revelation of some of the horrors of institutionalization, especially for folks with mental health issues. And as the storyline goes, R. Patrick McMurphy was a hellraiser, got in trouble in a fight in a bar, and in order to avoid going to prison, going to jail, he opted to go to a mental health facility, thinking that this would be an easier sort of thing for him to deal with, and that he would hustle them and kind of just, get, do his time and get out. And when he gets into this mental health facility, he discovers that it's worse than prison. He meets Nurse Ratched, who's like worse than any warden could ever be, and that he's even more stuck there than he would have been had he been in prison. And so finally, he decides he got to get out. So one day they're in the day room, and all the patients, and he says, "Look, I'm getting the hell out of here." And the other patients looked at him and said, "Man, Mac, you can't. Where are you going to get out of? We're locked. We're locked in. We can't. Nurse Ratched won't let us out." He said, "I'm not going to talk to Nurse Ratched." He said, "I'm going to take that sink off the wall. I'm going to pull that sink off the wall. I'm going to throw it through the window. I'm going to leave and go downtown. I'm going to meet a girl. I'm going to have a good time. I just want to get the hell out of here." And the other patient said, "Mac, you can't take the sink off the wall and throw it through the window. Are you crazy?" And Max says, who wants to bet me that I can't do that?" And these guys are, they have mental health issues, but they know a good bet when they hear one. And so so they say, "Yeah, we'll bet you, Mac." So they put cigarettes down on the table. That was the commodity for betting. And Mac goes over to the sink. Now, in the movie, Jack Nicholson plays R. Patrick McMurphy. Goes over to the sink, puts his arm around one side of the sink and gets his other arm around the other part of the sink, and he starts pulling on the sink. And the other guys are watching this, and they're not sure whether he can do it or not. And he's shaking the sink, and finally he falls down to the ground. The sink is still on the wall, and he seems to be defeated by the sink. And the guys say, "Hey, you see, we told you couldn't do it." And they go to get their cigarette. He said, "Boys, boys, boys, back off." He said, "I was just warming up." So he goes back over to the sink, spits on his hands, rubs his hands together, puts his one hand underneath the part of the sink. He brings the other hand around the top onto the faucet of the sink. Now he has this incredible grip, and he starts to shake, and he's pulling, and he's shaking the sink, and he's pulling, and the camera kind of zooms in on the vein in his neck is bulging on, and he's starting to sweat, and he's grimacing, and finally he falls down to the ground, and the sink is still on the wall. And the guy said, "We knew you couldn't do this, Mac." And he stood up, dusted himself off, and he said, "At least I tried." Okay? And he walks away. Very dramatic scene. That when I read that in the book and then saw the movie, the power of trying something that no one else has done, even if you know that it's a long shot, or that it's something that's really challenging, or out of, there's some things about it out of your control. And that's really, I think, our challenge. The stuff that we're called to do here is incredibly hard, right? People with disabilities have been devalued, marginalized, stereotyped, dismissed by society, and our agenda is to reverse that, right? To change that up, and it's not easy. And many of us have become complacent, or we've just sort of accepted our plight as, like a third alternative, like this is group homes, this is the best it can get, and day program stuff. And yet I think what we're trying to do in this educational series is really break open from some of those constraints, right? Community mapping is the third big step in the process. Community is like a puzzle. It is challenging. It is not easy. There's uncontrolled variables when we're dealing with community, right? But there's incredible possibilities and opportunities, and unless we try, we're never really going to know. So much like we've done in the past, here's my contact information. I know you guys know how to get in touch with me if you need to, if there's any questions that you have. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kind of open this up for some conversation. Tim will be able to go into the chat room to see if there's any questions or reactions. If we don't have any there, we can engage live with any questions that you might have. But things are getting a little bit more challenging for us as we move from this micro to begin this macro, process. Understanding community, mapping it, identifying resources is the key to discovery of possibility. Our work is just starting when we discover it, but it's a critically important step. So let me kind of just open this up. Let me toss it back to Tim with any questions or comments that might have come into the chat room, and then we could take anything live up until whatever time we have available to us. Tim?
Thanks, Al. I just wanted to jump in. I noticed sort of a small detail, and maybe it was intended or not intended, but I noticed the background on your slides is kind of a passing of the baton from one hand to the next. Mm-hmm. And, in thinking about even some of the examples that you discussed today, about, like meetup.com, or even things like a gardening club and those sorts of things. I think what gets lost, and I've had conversations with some of our future speakers as well, is this in the piece of advocacy is really sort of polling, or even simply asking what interests those in the IDD community have, and how to connect them into those particular avenues. And I know in our last session, we talked about, you had used an example about, bowling alleys and sort of the bowling culture that existed very strongly in previous decades. And I think as all people are raised and grow up, you're very often influenced early by, the interests of your family and your parents, and what they're interested in kind of gets passed on, or if you have siblings, the same thing. And that shapes your interest, and maybe your DNA is sort of wired to gravitate to those things anyways, but it's still your environment that's presenting that to you. So you're heavily influenced by it. But as you also said too, through some of the quotes, is that, humans have this ability to want to sort of reinvent and create. So unlike a pet or an animal that can be very content in a small space or something they're familiar with, humans like the familiar, but they also like to discover something new. And I think that's where the connection that we sort of need to bridge, or the gap or what have you, is really finding out what people with disabilities want to do, because some of those things may be similar to what their families have encouraged them to do, but they may have interests outside of that point. And how we sort of find out that information, and give them opportunities to engage in things that they either, again, want to or wouldn't normally be exposed to because of whatever environments they're confined to. And that's a big challenge, but it's really important for the community piece, because again, I think many times we pigeon individuals that are in the IDD community into just doing certain types of activities. Like, we've already decided that those are the activities that they're supposed to do, instead of what can we open up to,
Right.
new and inventive topics.
Right.
So I was just kind of thinking about what you had said in our last session, and then kind of what you had brought together in this session. And, again, I think through our grant here, we're trying to bring in speakers such as yourself that really give us those tools and trainings as to how to try to identify those things, instead of just maintaining the status quo. And I'm not saying that our agencies aren't doing a great job, and I'm not saying there aren't leaders in the field that aren't doing a great job, but there's still always that sort of, we can sort of fall back into
Yeah.
routine, and
Yeah.
that may need to be, challenged,
Yeah.
certainly.
Tim, the overview that you just identified, there were so many things that could be unpacked in what you said. And two quick things that that came to mind as you were talking about the historical stereotyping of folks with disabilities as this is what they can do, and this is what is possible for them. That whole legacy is a huge albatross around around people's neck, and so much of it is a fallacy, because folks' exposure and introduction to thing has been very, very limited. Then when you add a second piece to that, and research has shown this is pretty evident, and that is, when you think about maybe how you were raised, or Dan was raised, or I was raised when we were kids, um, our engagement with community was we began to learn that and understand that through observation of our family, right? Our moms, our dads, our brothers, sisters, and when they would take us someplace, we would sort of watch what they did and how they did it, and then began to create sort of an approach for ourselves as we came of age, in terms of engagement. Right? Now, we know that families who have children with disabilities engage less. They do far less in community than a family that doesn't have a child with a disability. And so consequently, two things happen in that reality. One is kids with disabilities, they don't observe a whole lot because their families are not as engaging with them than they might be if they didn't have a child with disability. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I just think that's reality. I think that families engage less because it is so damn hard to engage when you have a disability. That family's got to figure out, where do I park, and what happens if my child has a meltdown, and will there be an accessible bathroom, and I mean all these kinds of things that families have to factor in order to engage, get in the way, those logistics. Consequently, the child with disability growing up has much less of a vision of possibility, right? Because they've observed far less. So consequently, it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy of devaluation that just gets in the way. And add on to that the stereotypic stuff that you referenced, where, well, this is, what we think people with disabilities can do or ought to do. All of that BS has gotten in the way, and that has led to this sort of this pall that we have over us even today. So I think that, I think that part of our awakening here is really to begin to say, well, man, oh man, this doesn't have to be. And is it easy to solve or reverse? Hell no, it's not easy. That's why we have projects like the one that you're running, Tim. It's I mean, we've got to just stay at this, and we've got to talk about it, and we got to think about it, and we got to peel some things back on the onion, and then take what we're learning and try to apply it anew. And so we've got a long, long way to go. But one last point that you referenced, let me just make this, and then we can open it up to any other perspective that folks might want to take. In the last session, we talked about social capital, and we talked about a tool called a cultural profile. And a cultural profile is just a conversation and an examination about what somebody might like, what somebody might be interested in. So the cultural profile from the micro side meets the community mapping from the macro side and begins to give us a target for, in a cultural profile, if we discover that Tim Ferguson, likes to garden and really enjoys gardening, and we discover that in a cultural profile, then the community mapping process discovers the Buell Gardening Club, right? So now we have that target. So these are sort of just pieces of that community puzzle that we're trying to put together in our effort to get people more meaningfully engaged. And when I say meaningfully engaged, I mean that right now, every person on this call knows that the engagement that happens at their agency is usually contrived. And it's oftentimes a couple people in the van going to the mall. And that's not a put down. I'm not putting anybody down. I'm just saying that is not meaningful engagement. That's just killing time. It's just doing something because we have the time to do it. We got the van. What the hell? Let's just go to the mall. But it doesn't really lead to somebody building a relationship and then beginning to discover more about who they are and how they fit into this world.
Well, and I think no, I think to add on to that too, and then Dan, did you have something? Because I could see maybe you did, but I just wanted to say, when it comes to your example that you just gave, Al, I think, there should be more of a buffet or a larger portfolio of opportunities instead of, again, just the traditional silos in which, we tend to fall into the traps of like going to the mall. And I think that's true with anyone, which is why, and again, these themes are so universal, even beyond the IDD community, is just that the less exposure that you have as any individual, the tougher it is to build relationships with people, but then also build relationships with new topics and new ideas. It's not just an interpersonal thing. It can be a personal content thing. And so, that, as you said, that those profiles lead to the mapping. But Dan, go ahead, because I saw that you turned your mute off.
I just, the point I wanted to make was that I think in terms of our expectations when we work with people, we acknowledge that it's hard, but I don't think that we always acknowledge the fact that what it takes is a quality of tenacity and creativity to make these things work. And a lot of the things that you were talking about, bringing the community in, engaging people in groups, expanding the thinking of community to include people, this is the hard work of what we do. And I don't think that we necessarily give ourselves a credit for exactly what it takes. And some of the things you talk about, like bringing the community in, well, I've done it the right way and the wrong way. You know what I mean? And so, my experience there is you have to have a clear strategy about how, what your people are going to get out of bringing the community in. Otherwise, they're just there, and they're displacing your, you know, if they're not, if it's not something that connects them, then it doesn't have as much value as something that does.
Right.
You know, in terms of expanding the thinking of community, that's in some ways, that's the easiest part of this. You know, people just don't. I just give you an example. My wife was for years involved in a community garden, as you were talking about, and so there was a flood there from Hurricane Sandy, and so they had to rebuild the whole garden, and they raised some money, and they did that. And so my wife said, "Well, okay, we'll build some handicapped accessible beds." And so the push, some of the garden members who are, you know, decent people said, "Oh, what do we need that for? You know, we don't have any members like that."
Right.
And you know, I just told my wife, I said, "Well, if you're using public land for a community garden, you better have handicapped accessible beds." Just explain it to them that way.
Right.
That it's just not the right thing to do. And long story short, he built the beds, and then there was a fella who used the wheelchair, who lived in town. Well, he became part of the group. And the thing is, so here was a guy who was pretty isolated otherwise. And next thing you know, he's going to the garden every day, talking to everybody and doing his own thing. But I don't think we can underestimate the amount of creativity and forethought it takes to make these things work.
Yeah.
I've done things where, you know, the community was brought into an agency that I ran, and we would, and in some cases, the people didn't benefit that much from it, you know, if it was done wrong. And in other cases, there was one where they had, you know, the day program. They had a bunch of animals that they took care of in the day program, like a little farm, and they had a couple llamas and some goats and some sheep. And what happens is the guy who ran the program was very good at engaging the community. So it became a destination for grammar school kids to go and see and of course, there were the guys who took care of the animals were his group. And so they became the hosts, and then it became a very effective thing where children met adults with, you know, developmental disabilities, and they became less scary. So it had some, you know, it was purposeful. But I think all these things we talk about, engaging people, getting them involved, I mean, I think the underlying theme is the thing that's most important to people is having relationships. And, you know, what you see every day when you work with people is the people who are connected to their families, who are approved of by them, who have meaningful relationships, who have things going on in the community, they're really happy. And it has nothing to do with how impaired they are. It has to do with just whether they were included. And then you meet other people who don't have those experiences, and there's huge barriers for them, all kinds of things where they're not comfortable about, you know, they'll go to the mall or something and walk around and go in a store, but they're not the kind of people on their own. They don't have this spontaneity of just talking to somebody, or, you know, not worrying, well, do people think that I'm different, and so I can't talk to people. And that's really how these things have to unfold. You know, it's like, and most people are pretty good-hearted people, but they just, you know, their first thought is not like, well, gee, how can we bring people in and include them? It's more like a coincidence. So, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that when we work with people and mentor them to do these things, I think we have to do a little work with them and say, like, well, there's an art to this.
Right.
You know, you have to, you know, it is like, this is a profession. You do this, you're good at it. You get people, you talk people into including somebody. That's a big win.
Right. You know, so much that you shared there, Dan, are powerful. And the interesting thing, you know, go back to your wife's experience with the garden group, and the notion, her recommendation, well, let's have some accessible beds, and the other members are saying, well, like, why would we ever do that? You know, who would, you know, that's sort of, again, not malicious. It's just It's just that people just don't see the relevance or the connectedness of folks who are experiencing disabilities in their everyday life. They think we're taking care of that. And their money to United Way and their tax dollars or whatever is handling that issue. And again, it's not a it's not a malicious thing. It's just there's just no relevance. And so I think that's the biggest part of the uphill challenge. But excellent points, all that you made, Dan. And any other questions or comments that we have? I see Sarah, do you have
Sarah,
something?
are you ready? I do want to give you the trophy for greatest virtual background, I think, of only competing with me, Sarah, so, but it's better. So go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sarah Travers. I'm the Director of Day Services at Joanio. And I just wanted to qualify the point about exposure. So I was born and raised in Jamaica, the country. And growing up, I did not know that, and I'm speaking for myself, not the country. I did not know that my cousins who were deaf and mute at the time were disabled. And so the only time we recognized the difference was when we were going to school and they would stay home. And I feel that the exposure then provided for them a rich life because they had to do all the things that we have to do. So when I migrated to the US, I was 13. And then my first entry into working with people with disabilities, I started as a DSP at YAI. And it challenged me then to see how the structures that we had to put in place, like safety, prevented people from doing the things that they could do, right? So you had to go through this mechanism of, so I would grow up with my cousins, they would cook breakfast, but there's this whole thing around fire safety. And so you have people who live in a group home that can't, even though they're capable, just go and fry an egg or just go and, prepare a meal. And so, on one sense, back home, we lack the resources that we have here. But then I think because of the lack of resources, they have much more opportunities to be in community and to sort of nobody's doing it for you, right? And there's a lack of understanding a lot of times of what's actually happening. So it's just, there's something different, but we're not going to play to that difference. You're just going to have to follow along. So if all of us are, cutting the lawn or doing whatever it is that you're doing, you're just going to have to do that. So, my dream goal would to figure out how to take what's here, there, and what's there here. And, I think it would be just like the Nirvana.
Those are excellent points, Sarah. In some ways, this is so simple, yet in other ways, it is so darn complex. And the simplicity of, we all want to, participate. We all want to be just a part of this bigger thing. And we all have something we could bring to the experience. That's simple. Yet the ways people have been divided or limited or devalued or stereotyped is, that's the stuff that makes it hard. And much like Dan was saying when in his summary, that mapping the resources in a community is the easy part. I mean, you can just kind of go and discover what's out there, but it's really creating the bridge of connection that is really the challenging part. We're going to talk about that. That's really primary topic for our next session, which is really thinking about the social infrastructure. How do people, when they gather, what do they do and why do they do what they do and how do they do what they do? And then how might we be able to support or assist somebody who has really never been a part of that to become a part of that? So, but I think your point, your personal experience, really, really powerful, Sarah, in that you kind of grew up with this notion that these are just my cousins. They're just like everybody else, and so somebody might have difficulty speaking or hearing, or that's no big deal. They're a part of the mix as well, and that naturalness that you grew up with. You know, when you back up now and say, why are people, you know, not naturally a part of something? It doesn't seem to make sense. I know that I had the same experience kind of growing up with, and I talked about this in our first session with my cousin who had Down syndrome, and, you know, lives right across the street from me, and we grew up together, and I never knew that. I mean, Down syndrome was just a natural part. We never even knew that it was Down syndrome. We didn't really even care. I mean, she was just like our cousin, and she was just right there with us, whatever we did, everything. But then when we went off to school, much like your own experience, Carrie didn't go to school. And now we started learning this lesson. Well, Carrie just is not able to learn, or she's not smart, or she can't understand, or whatever the baggage that then begins to get encased. And none of the other kids in the school got to meet Carrie or know her. So they go through their life with whatever baggage they're carrying about people like Carrie, and the two things kind of go off in their own tangent, and then we have this great divide that we're talking about trying to mend here today in the sessions that we're doing. So excellent points, and there's lots of stuff we've got to add into this conversation that we will, because we have 4 more sessions that we're gonna be spending focusing in on this. So excellent. Thank you for sharing
Thank you.
that experience. Anything